We developed this mobile research gas exchange machine, which is nothing more than a large plastic box mounted on the front end of a forklift, and we have some fans in there stirring the air to get a uniform concentration, and then we take a sample back through the tube and run it through an infrared gas analyzer to measure the carbon dioxide and water vapor concentration once a second for 60 seconds. At the end of that period, the computer beeps at the operator, he lifts the chamber, and he moves to the next location. And during that time, the flux of carbon dioxide and water vapor is calculated. And so I'm trying to use some plumes from our local ethanol plant to give you a sense of the physical process that we're trying to characterize. You recall I said that carbon dioxide was invisible. And so I'm trying to give you a physical picture of what's happening in terms of gas exchange. And so this effort is to try to characterize those invisible effect of invisible forces that are very difficult to describe to people at times, and we are challenged in terms of trying to get people to understand the magnitude of the problem when they can't see it, feel it, or touch it. So we set up a study to look at various types of tillage on the tillage-induced carbon dioxide loss. On the left-hand side, we had what we call our no-till plot. We ran the tractor through the plot to get the same amount of wheel compaction on all of the treatments. Then we had a small volume of soil disturbed with a very shallow strip tillage that was accomplished through the use of a fluted coulter. We had the V-shaped zone with a fertilizer knife that went to 150 millimeters deep with the approximate shape that you see there. We had a second fertilizer knife, the next slide, on the left-hand side that gave more a U-shaped volume of soil disturbance. In the middle, we had what we called a low disturbance subsoil shank that gave a very narrow trench of loosened soil down to 350 millimeters deep. And then we compared that to the moldboard plow to a depth of 250 millimeters. And so these are the 6 types of tillage that we evaluated in looking at the carbon dioxide loss. So when we take a look at the yield results, on the y-axis is the cumulative loss for a 5-hour period on the left-hand side and a 24-hour period on the right-hand side. And the initials on the x-axis represent the moldboard plow, the subsoil shank, the fertilizer knife, and then clear over to the extreme is the no-till treatment. And you can see that in both cases, the moldboard plow gives us the largest amount of carbon dioxide released, followed by the subsoil shank. Various forms of strip tillage showed a decline with the minimum loss of carbon dioxide from the no-till treatment. So if you start to think about it a little bit, we repeated as many times and we get basically the same types of relationship. And so if we take a look at the cross-sectional area from those schematics that I gave you and assume a unit length of row, we have a volume of soil that's disturbed by the tillage operation. And so we've done that, and we plot the next slide, the cumulative loss on the y-axis. There we go. Cumulative loss on the y-axis and the cross-sectional area, or the equivalent of the soil volume, on the y-axis. And you can see at the top, the moldboard plow has the largest amount of CO2 released. The subsoil shank is in there. The various forms of strip tillage are in there. And with the no-till, we get the least amount of carbon dioxide. And if we do a simple linear regression, it doesn't show on the slide, but in my slide it shows an R-squared of about 0.97, a good linear relationship. The results suggest that the carbon dioxide released is proportional to the volume of soil disturbed. Now, for those of you who are farmers and drive a tractor, you'll know that the amount of diesel required is much greater for the moldboard plow treatment than for the no-till treatment or other forms of strip tillage. So from my perspective, intensive tillage becomes a double negative. The carbon loss from the soil and the additional carbon going back to the atmosphere of CO2 from the consumption of a large amount of diesel fuel. We did a second study, this time using the same implement, the moldboard plow, to allow us to get different volumes of soil disturbed. The upper one was 100 millimeters deep. It was as shallow as we could go and still call it inversion tillage, represented by the moldboard plow. We went through two intermediate depths and to a depth of 280 millimeters, which is as deep as we could go and pull it with the tractor that we had. So we have the same piece of equipment, but different volumes of soil disturbed. We take a look at the cumulative results for a 24-hour period. Next slide, you can see that with the no-till treatment, we have the least amount of CO2 lost. And as you go progressively deeper from 100 millimeters to 280 millimeters, there's approximately a linear increase in the amount of CO2 that's released. Another bit of evidence that the CO2 released is proportional to the volume of soil disturbed in the tillage operation. So we wanted to take this to the extreme, and I had an opportunity to go to a farmer field day and evaluate two different no-till drills. And they're defined as no-till drills by the manufacturer. This is one of the examples, and it happens to be in South Dakota where they do things in a big way. And so we were able to, we had this opportunity and wanted to evaluate the CO2 and the water vapor loss from these two no-till drills. On the left-hand side, on the next slide, we have what I call a low disturbance drill with a double disc opener that just basically cuts a slot and drops the seed in. On the right-hand side is what I call a tine opener, and it results in a high disturbance no-till drill. And if you take a look at the surface, you can see that there's much more of the wheat residue on the surface with the low disturbance than with the high disturbance drills. And even with them having packing wheels to reconsolidate the soil, we were able to measure some differences in that. But if we take a look at it from the broad view and the broad perspective, on the extreme left-hand side, there's a non-disturbed area where there was nothing done to it. But then we went through there with the one pass with the low disturbance drill, followed by the high disturbance drill, a disc harrow, and the moldboard plow. And so you can see over a large section the relative difference in the soil mixing and the incorporation of the crop residue, even though they're both considered no-till drills. So when you look at the data from that, with a few measurements, on the left-hand side is carbon dioxide loss, and on the right hand is evaporation rate expressed in millimeters per hour. So where there was no disturbance, you can see the numbers where we got relatively small amounts of water vapor and carbon dioxide loss. With the low disturbance drill, represented by the bars in the middle, there was virtually no difference in the carbon dioxide and a slight increase in the water vapor. But with a high disturbance drill, you see both of them increase substantially above the low disturbance drill and the control condition. Again, so what that, well, it was gratifying to me because it reassured that the technology that we're using with that portable chamber was sensitive enough to pick up some of these very small differences. And I'm happy that it came out this way, but I want to reassure you that even with this high disturbance drill, that is nothing very close to what we get with the moldboard plow and other forms of intensive tillage. But the principle is the same. If you want to minimize carbon loss, you have to minimize the volume of soil disturbed. So tillage makes this gas exchange happen. And I think that now that we understand that, it's changed my thinking a little bit, that we must try to find better ways to manage the soil. So now I was asked to talk a little bit about carbon sequestration, the next slide. And I find that I have too much information on the slide to present it in the time that it was allotted. And so I'm going to give you a one-sentence statement about each of the slides, which is my summarization of it. And if you want to talk about it in more detail, I'll be happy to visit with you after the presentation. One of my colleagues in St. Paul, Minnesota, is John Baker and his co-authors. They found that there was really no difference in carbon sequestration with no-till compared to conventional till when they sampled to 1 meter depth. That's just the way it is. There was no statistical difference. Another example of a similar finding by Ratan Lal and some of his colleagues from Ohio State. They found that the no-till impacts were soil-specific, but they found no difference in the accumulation of carbon between the no-till and the conventional till to a depth of 60 centimeters that they sampled. The next slide shows some work by Christopher et al. They found that the sampling depths effects were important in terms of trying to quantify the carbon, but they, again, could not find any difference in the carbon sequestered between the no-till and the conventional till system down to 60 centimeters. The next slide shows a fourth example of some work from Sædskifte in 2011, and they were able to show that there was greater carbon in the surface layers of the no-till relative to the conventional till, but there was no difference in the carbon between 30 and 60 centimeters. And they also verified that there was a tremendous amount of variability in that subsoil depth that contributed to the lack of statistical significance when you looked at the carbon in the entire profile. And that is a significant finding because when people are making some of these comparisons, when you have 2 or 3 times the variability within the profile, it makes it difficult to interpret. So there's a lot of data that suggests there's no difference, but I think there's other ecosystem services that are important to us that we need to reevaluate it, and we're in a process of trying to identify specifically the type of equipment they were using, the speed of the operation, to see if there's some clue about the details that prevents the no-till from having any more carbon sequestration. So on the next slide, we make a point about why we're interested in carbon dioxide. Our Energy Information Agency in the U.S. have shown that carbon dioxide is responsible for about 81% of the global greenhouse effect. So it's one of the reasons that I'm interested in following the carbon dioxide. And so it's why I continue to do that. But we must understand that there are other greenhouse gases that are important to us. The concept of global warming potential with methane has a global warming potential of 21, and nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of about 296. Well, methane's a problem with cattle production, but nitrous oxide is a problem with also animal production and the use of nitrogen fertilizer. And so I have 2 examples of what some of the scientists have found in the US and Canada on nitrous oxide. This is Philip Rochette and his colleagues from Canada, and they found that there was the nitrous oxide emissions in the no-till system depend on the soil type. And what they found with a heavier soil, with a high clay content, there was more nitrous oxide emissions from that soil as opposed to a well-drained, gravelly loam. Some of the people in the next slide, at Purdue University, Amanande et al. In 2011, they found that 50% of the nitrous oxide emission occurs shortly after the application of the fertilizer. And then that the no-till emissions were lower than, from the no-till than the conventional till, but it was not statistically significant. And as you might expect, there's a lot of variation in that. So we're promoting no-till, but we're not out of the woods in terms of what it means in terms of the greenhouse gases. And there's a lot more research that needs to be done, and I think that we have to be careful in terms of what kind of recommendations we make, and hopefully that we can do our homework before we make claims about what no-till does for all of the greenhouse gases. Next slide, yeah. So, we have to look at the soil as a living biological system. It's composed of earthworms and insects and rodents, and they are part of this living soil team. And they work in tandem with the microorganisms and fungi, and are part of this factory of workers that are doing the nutrient cycling for us. And so if you want members of that factory to be working for you efficiently, then we want to make sure that they have enough energy, and this is where carbon comes into the system. Carbon is their food source that keeps them functioning. And I want to make a statement about intensive tillage that destroys the biological and ecological integrity of the soil. If you had a natural system, and this is admittedly very idealized, but the first pass with the moldboard plow or some form of intensive tillage breaks it up into large clods and aggregates, and then we continue to pulverize the soil, breaking it up after forms of secondary tillage. And it makes it difficult to understand how those little critters cannot work very effectively for us. The intensive tillage opens up the all-you-can-eat buffet for the birds and the microbes. The seagulls, following that tillage implement, are picking up remnants of worms and grubs and insects. So they're doing some damage to the biology with that tillage implement. But you're also aware that tillage creates twin problems with respect to accelerated soil degradation and accelerated soil erosion. And from my perspective, when you look at this natural biological system that contains a lot of life, when this intensive tillage event happens, it's analogous to us humans to be the equivalent of an earthquake, a hurricane, a tornado, and a forest fire all rolled into one perturbation event. Now, if that happened to you in your house 3 or 4 times a year, would you be very happy? You wouldn't be very productive. And so it is with the soil system that we have to work with. And so I have some other colleagues that say the moldboard plow is contributing to soil degradation and poses some threats to food problems, food security. Huggins and Reginald from the University of Washington have made this statement that agricultural land degradation is one of the most serious environmental problems worldwide. Unfortunately, some of those results take a very long time to be demonstrated, but in the long term, in our case in the U.S., we've been in intensive agriculture for 240, 250 years. And in Denmark, you've been farming the soils for 1,000, 1,200 years or more, and you're still having good luck in terms of production. But from my perspective, plow tillage is the master of disaster in terms of setting the soil up for wind and water erosion, causing a carbon loss like I've demonstrated. We lose a lot of water with that open tillage event, and all this contributes to a decline in soil, water, and air quality. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the benefits and the ecosystem services that are attributed to soil carbon. I use this analogy with the wagon wheel. The wheel is a symbol of strength, it's a symbol of unity, it's a symbol of progress. And for that wagon wheel to be strong, you need a lot of spokes in it. Well, from my perspective, the hub of that wagon wheel is carbon. And emanating from from that hub is this number of spokes that you see, each representing an individual environmental benefit. Each benefit by itself is no big deal with respect to the environment, but when you integrate 14 of these factors into one wagon wheel, it becomes a very big deal with respect to the environment. And if we were able to find some way to get farmers to have carbon credits or offsets, managing that carbon, I think, would be agriculture's wheel of fortune. Though these ecosystem services and the carbon associated with them are financially significant, and taking this phrase from Toffer from the UN Environmental Program, to degrade or damage them is tantamount to economic suicide. Unfortunately, we don't have any good mechanism for assigning a euro value to what this carbon means to us in terms of ecosystem services. We're all capitalists. We understand the value of a dollar, but we don't understand what the carbon is doing for us. And our challenge is to find some way to make it clear that there is economic value in managing that carbon. So, for re-emphasis, carbon conservation agriculture is carbon management. We produce food, fiber, and biofuels as part of those ecosystem services, but we do it with less erosion, less pollution, clean water, fresher air, sometimes lower fertilizers, and we have a nice, beautiful landscape that's very satisfying. And so from my perspective, soil carbon is a priceless key to the planet's health and our environmental quality. This conservation agriculture is a triple win strategy. Win number one is growing the food and fiber to feed the world. Win number two is growing the biomass for renewable energy. And win number three is protecting the environment and all of its resources. And I think this is one heck of a lot of responsibility for our farmers. And I commend them for taking that challenge on. So, intensive tillage causes this accelerated downward spiral in soil degradation. We get degraded soils, we get carbon loss, like I've showed you, and we get water loss. And the question is, how long can we continue to degrade the soil before it's going to come and bite us on the backside in terms of waking up to what we're doing to the soil system? My answer to that, if you want to stop erosion, if you want to save some carbon, park the plow. This is an example of what I think is a memorial to the plow, and it was a farmer named Ken Scott in southeast Iowa. And I have not met the man, but I have taken many pictures of this and think that he had it right. This was a place to put the plow. So I end my presentation with my little cartoon character, Carby Carbon. He tells you to keep your carbon footprint small and manage carbon for ecosystem services. Now, I don't put this out here to get a chuckle from you, but if I do, that's good. But I put it out there for your children and your grandchildren to start asking questions about what is this carbon stuff that we're talking about. Because they're going to inherit this earth that we're messing up a little bit. And the sooner they start asking questions, the sooner they will start doing some research, the sooner they will come up with some solution. And so if I have any impact, I would rather impact the young students, but also have some impact with you. And if it makes you smile, so much the better. With that, I'll end and respond to whatever questions you might have. And I'd like to know what my time was.
Lars Engelsen, can you say anything about the carbon footprint from producing a ton of corn in, for example, no-till and in a plowing system? So what would the difference be?
Okay, that's another excellent question. And in my retirement, I am working on calculating the carbon footprint for the agriculture in the county where I live. You have to understand that if you're going to use intensive tillage and plenty of diesel fuel, you're contributing, that contributes to the carbon footprint. With no-till, there's less diesel fuel, so there's a benefit there. When you harvest that grain, if you harvest it in a timely manner, you may or may not have to use propane to dry the grain. That carbon that's in the corn that goes through the cattle transfers the carbon footprint to the cattle production system. And the other part of the carbon footprint is many of our farmers will be putting on 200 to 300 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. That nitrogen, it takes 1.2 tons of carbon released for each ton of nitrogen fixed using the Haber-Bosch process. That's a pretty expensive part of the footprint. And so I have not got specific numbers on it, and there's a lot of variability and a lot of different aspects that you have to consider, and I'm slowly working on that as part of my idle time in retirement. Hopefully, I will have, in 6 months, I will have a first approximation of that for corn production, wheat, soybeans, dairy, hog production, beef cattle production, and turkey production that we have in our agricultural community. So it's on the drawing board, but unfortunately I don't have anything to report to you now.
No, but can you say, will it be doubled up when we are plowing?
No, it won't be doubled up. If you put the nitrogen fertilizer on the corn,
that will be the same, the fertilizer and everything else. But we compare a no-till system with a plowing system.
Well, you can do the calculations based on the amount of diesel fuel, and that's how much it will reduce it. But there's a lot of other things you have to consider.
But you have all the emission from the ground off, as you tell us now.
And that is a difficult one, because what I showed you is what happens in the short term, and we have made measurements out to 90 days after tillage. We can still see a difference, but the difference gets smaller and smaller as we go, because that plowed soil is reconsolidating back to a no-till system with Mother Nature in terms of raindrop impact and traffic. And so the differences get smaller with time. And so it's maybe a little bit misleading when I talk about the large differences immediately after tillage, but it does stress the point that something's happening. And if we can minimize that, we will be better off in the long run. Good question.
Yes. Thank you very much. And sorry to tell you, now we have to stop this session, but we continue the next one with a panel discussion.